For decades, this mansion stood as a monument to one of Hollywood's greatest visionaries, a place where Oscar-winning films were planned, million-dollar deals were made, and some of the biggest names in entertainment walked through its doors. From the outside, it looked like the American dream. But behind these walls was a very different story. A story of enormous success, devastating financial losses, family sacrifices, and a house that would eventually be left behind. Today, this once proud Hollywood estate sits as a reminder that even legends can lose everything. So what really happened? How did one of the greatest movie directors in history end up walking away from an $11 million mansion? And what secrets are still hidden inside today? Let's step inside. Perched high above Los Angeles, hidden behind mature trees and iron gates, sat one of Hollywood's most impressive private estates. It wasn't simply a luxury mansion, it was a statement. More than 8,000 square feet of handcrafted architecture, sprawling terraces overlooking the city, grand entertaining rooms, private gardens, and enough space to host Hollywood's elite away from the cameras. Every detail reflected success. But unlike many celebrity homes built for attention, this one became something else entirely. It became a workplace. Scripts were discussed here. Actors came looking for advice. Friends gathered long into the night talking about films that would eventually become classics. The owner was Francis Ford Coppola. Today, he's remembered as one of the greatest directors ever to live. But when he first arrived in Hollywood, nobody expected that. Born in Detroit in 1939 and raised in New York, Coppola spent much of his childhood battling illness. Polio confined him indoors for long periods, leaving him with little to do except imagine stories. While other children played outside, Francis built worlds inside his head. His father, Carmine Coppola, was a respected musician with the NBC Symphony Orchestra, while his mother, Italia, encouraged creativity throughout the family. Money wasn't endless, but imagination certainly was. After studying theater and film, Coppola struggled through years of rejection. Like countless young filmmakers, he took whatever work he could find: low-budget horror films, screenwriting jobs, anything that paid the bills. Very few people noticed him. Then, in the early 1970s, everything changed. A novel called The Godfather landed on his desk. At first, Coppola didn't even want to direct it. He considered it little more than a commercial gangster story and feared it would damage his reputation. Ironically, financial pressure forced him to accept. He needed the money. That single decision changed movie history forever. Released in 1972, The Godfather became a worldwide phenomenon. Audiences had never seen organized crime portrayed with such depth, emotion, and realism. The film won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Coppola became one of Hollywood's hottest directors almost overnight. The success continued with The Godfather Part 2, widely considered one of the greatest sequels ever made. Then came Apocalypse Now, a production so chaotic that it nearly destroyed him. Typhoons halted filming, actors quit, budgets exploded, Martin Sheen suffered a heart attack. Coppola mortgaged almost everything he owned just to keep production alive. He later admitted there were moments when he genuinely believed he'd lose everything. But when the film finally premiered, it became another masterpiece. Success on that scale brought extraordinary wealth, and with that wealth came this mansion. For years, the estate represented the absolute peak of Hollywood success. Inside its walls, Coppola wasn't simply a director, he had become an empire builder. Beyond filmmaking, he expanded into wineries, hotels, restaurants, and publishing. His children grew up surrounded by creativity. Family dinners often included conversations about films, music, and storytelling. His daughter Sophia would eventually become an Oscar-winning filmmaker herself. His son Roman also entered the movie industry. The mansion became more than a luxurious address. It became the headquarters of an extraordinary creative family. But behind the success, the cracks were already beginning to appear, because Francis Ford Coppola had one habit that terrified accountants. No matter how much money he earned, he always betted on the next dream. And eventually, those dreams would come with a devastating price. By the early 1980s, Francis Ford Coppola had achieved something few directors ever do. He had won multiple Academy Awards, directed films that critics called masterpieces, earned millions of dollars, owned luxury homes, built an internationally recognized family name. For most people, that would have been enough. But Coppola was never interested in simply being a successful director. He wanted independence. He dreamed of building his own creative empire, one where no Hollywood studio could tell him what stories to tell. It was an ambitious vision, but it came with enormous risks. Instead of protecting the fortune he'd earned from The Godfather and Apocalypse Now, Coppola poured huge amounts of money into new ventures. He bought businesses. He invested in vineyards in California's Napa Valley. He expanded into hotels. He restored historic properties. He backed experimental films that larger studios wouldn't touch. To Coppola, success wasn't measured by money sitting in the bank. It was measured by creating something lasting. The problem was that creativity rarely follows a budget. Several of his films struggled at the box office. Some barely recovered their production costs. Others became critical disappointments. Every setback meant dipping further into his own finances. Unlike many Hollywood directors, Coppola often guaranteed loans with his own assets. That meant, if a project failed, his personal wealth was at risk, including the mansion. The pressure became relentless. Friends described Coppola as someone constantly balancing enormous financial commitments. One successful project would pay off the previous one. Then he'd immediately risk those profits on the next dream. It was a cycle that repeated for decades. At one point, he openly admitted that he was millions of dollars in debt. For someone who had once been considered one of Hollywood's richest filmmakers, it was a remarkable confession. But there was another tragedy unfolding behind the scenes. In 1986, Coppola's eldest son, Giancarlo Coppola, was killed in a speedboat accident at just 22 years old. The loss devastated the entire family. Friends noticed a change in Francis afterwards. Work became different. Life became different. Money no longer seemed to matter in quite the same way. Family did. His daughter Sophia has often spoken about growing up surrounded by filmmaking, but also by enormous expectations and constant financial uncertainty. The family experienced incredible privilege, but also incredible pressure, because every new project felt like another gamble. Sometimes it paid off, sometimes it didn't. As Hollywood changed through the 1990s and 2000s, younger directors emerged. Studios became increasingly focused on franchises, superheroes, and global blockbusters. Coppola's style of personal filmmaking became harder to finance. He found himself relying more heavily on the success of his wine business than on Hollywood itself. Ironically, the vineyards he'd once purchased, almost as a side project, became one of the strongest parts of his business empire. While many films struggled financially, the Coppola wineries flourished. Visitors came from around the world. The family name became just as well known in wine as it was in cinema. But maintaining multiple estates, businesses, and ambitious projects still required enormous amounts of money. Gradually, properties began changing hands. Some were sold, others were quietly left behind as priorities shifted. The famous Hollywood mansion that had once hosted producers, actors, and Oscar celebrations slowly disappeared from Coppola's daily life. The rooms that had echoed with conversations about cinema became silent. The gardens received fewer visitors. The house that had symbolized the peak of Hollywood success became little more than another asset from a different chapter of his life. Eventually, it was no longer the center of the Coppola family empire. Walking through the property today, it's easy to imagine what once happened here. Meetings that changed cinema, celebrations after award ceremonies, family gatherings, late-night conversations about stories that would captivate millions. Yet time has a way of catching every house. Luxury fades, memories remain, and even an £11 million mansion can't preserve the moments that made it special. For Coppola, the house had served its purpose. It represented one extraordinary era, but another challenge was already waiting, one that many believed was impossible. Even in his 80s, Francis Ford Coppola wasn't finished risking everything. In fact, he was about to make the biggest gamble of his entire career. Long after The Godfather, The Conversation, and Apocalypse Now had secured his place in cinema history, he was still chasing one dream that had never left him. For more than 40 years, Coppola spoke about making a film called Megalopolis. It was an idea he had first developed in the early 1980s, a vast Roman-inspired epic set in a futuristic New York. But every time he tried to make it, something stopped him. Studios thought it was too expensive, too ambitious, too risky. Some believed audiences simply wouldn't understand it. Most directors would have given up. Coppola didn't. Instead of waiting for Hollywood to approve it, he made a decision almost nobody else would have dared. He financed much of the film himself. Reports estimate he invested around $120 million of his own fortune, raising money in part by selling interests in his successful winery business. For a man in his 80s, it was an astonishing gamble. He wasn't doing it because he needed another hit. He wasn't trying to prove he could still direct. He simply wanted to make the film exactly as he imagined it. In many ways, it echoed the risks he'd taken decades earlier on Apocalypse Now. Once again, Francis Ford Coppola was putting everything on the line for a story he believed in. The production itself quickly became surrounded by rumors, reports of creative disagreements, an unusually demanding filming process, questions over the film's enormous budget. As always, Coppola ignored the noise. He had spent a lifetime being told that his biggest ideas wouldn't work. Sometimes the critics were wrong. Sometimes they were right. But he'd never allowed fear to decide for him. That attitude had defined his entire career. It had created masterpieces. It had cost him fortunes. And it had helped shape modern cinema. Looking back, the abandoned Hollywood mansion almost feels like a physical timeline of that extraordinary life. The grand entrance represented the optimism of a young director who had conquered Hollywood. The elegant rooms reflected decades of success, creativity, and family celebrations. And its eventual silence mirrored the reality that no chapter lasts forever. Today, Coppola's life looks very different. Much of his time is spent at his wineries in Napa Valley, where visitors come not just for the wine, but to experience the world he has built beyond filmmaking. His family legacy also continues. His daughter, Sofia Coppola, has become one of the most respected directors of her generation, winning an Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay and earning multiple Oscar nominations. His son, Roman Coppola, built a successful career as a director, producer, and screenwriter, collaborating with filmmakers, including Wes Anderson. His grandchildren have also begun entering the creative industries, extending a family tradition that now spans generations. The Coppola name is no longer attached to just one person. It has become a filmmaking dynasty. Yet, perhaps Francis Ford Coppola's greatest legacy isn't any single film. It's the example he set. He refused to let studios dictate every decision. He showed that filmmakers could fight for creative control, even when the financial consequences were enormous. As for the mansion itself, it remains a fascinating reminder of one of Hollywood's most remarkable careers. Behind its gates, fortunes were made, dreams were planned, history was written. And although Francis Ford Coppola eventually moved on, the house still stands as a monument to an era when one filmmaker dared to challenge Hollywood, and often won. This has been Old Money Media. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and let us know in the comments. Which abandoned mansion should we explore next? Until next time, thank you for watching.